Max Wardell, overheadathletics.com. We're talking about hip impingement and hip loading today. Recently, we've seen a rash of athletes who've come in for different diagnoses, UCL tears and labral tears at our new facility in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And they're often complaining about pinching in the front of the socket, which is where that hip joint actually impinges and potentially some of the capsule gets pinched in there. We want to teach you how you can clear that motion so you can better load away from the target and stay closed for longer in your throw. As somebody relatively flexible, I can do the front splits. I can tell you myself that this is probably not the best position to put my hip joints in if I'm getting pain and pinching. So one of the first things I want to chat with you guys about is avoiding positions that cause mechanical impingement and pinching in the hip. It's probably not your hip flexor if you feel it in the front of the joint, and doing something where you crank that hip into internal rotation to the point where it starts to be painful is one of the first things that you can stop doing to make sure that your hip doesn't hurt. But then we need to clear that range and make sure you have full range of motion, full articulation inside the socket. Despite the fact that this has become a popular stretch and is a great stretch for some people, it's not for everybody. So let's show you what you need to do. So one of the first things I tell people is you need to restore your hip extension. The two places that people are missing range, hip extension and hip flexion. If you can work on hip extension and hip flexion, which are often less provocative, meaning hamstring flexibility on the front leg, hip extension on the rear leg, start there. If you can unlock those ranges of motion, then you can start working into some hip abduction, bringing the legs out to the side, and rotation of the hips both ways. Yes, they're all important motions, but most people have major preclusions or losses in range of motion that limit them in their throw. And the most benign positions, which are hip extension and flexion, the least likely to irritate the joint and some of the most important to be able to get forward and through the throw. You don't have to necessarily stretch rotation. If you get yourself in a position where you're stretching the capsule, elongating certain muscles, you can improve your hip internal rotation by stretching into extension, or you can stretch into flexion and improve your hip internal rotation. So you don't always have to crank your knee inward to be able to improve that motion. We'll start with something like that, and then we'll move into something where you actually target more hip flexion in your throw. And I personally like to work on a lot of hamstring flexibility. A lot of times you're going to find people that are really limited in the hamstring. Easy way to go about doing that is go into that same position, work your way out, hug your leg, and then start working your way backwards, and then just hang out in this position. So I'm in a ton of hip flexion. I'm getting hamstring elongation at the same time, and as I get more flexible, I just inch my way further into the stretch, hugging this leg. Hang out there for a couple minutes at a time. Most people don't hold their stretches long enough. Now, if you started work on this stuff and you've improved over the course of time, then you can start working on some of the other things. But the big thing for you is making sure that you can control that range of motion through the throw. So we're going to teach you one exercise where you can actually control that range, and then something you can do in your actual throwing motion to make sure that you retain that range of motion and use better hip internal rotation to stay closed from the target. So you've spent some time improving your hip flexion and hip extension. Now we're going to work into a combined hip flexion, internal rotation, adduction stretch as I come in and pull out. So I'm working the glutes. This is really tough on that glute. This bottom hip drives in towards the other side, so that knee claps in. All my weight's on this side. Back is erect. I rotate under through the pelvis, squeeze the glute to come out. Most people don't do this quite right. I got pretty heavy weight on my pulley system here because it's elongating me eccentrically into the stretch, and then I concentrically come out. So now this is teaching me strength through length in a position where I'm coming here, which is approximating my hip load when I actually throw. So let's teach you how to better use that newfound range of motion and strength through the glute, which is often limited in our athletes. Going back to the beginning of our video, we find that athletes can't control that range. They fly open to the target, drag their arm, and that's why they're coming to see us for UCL injuries and labral injuries, which we see every day. So what we do is we want to pre-position athletes into a better rotated position, have them maintain that as they start to throw. And then we need to teach them how to get into that. So you might spend a week just starting from a position where not just the chest is turned, but the pelvis is actually rotated away. And then you might spend a little bit of time working on your full pitch, but what we like to do to bridge that gap between the two is start with a little toe touch, and all I do is load into the hip as I go forward. I see a lot of guys aggressively turn into the hip too early and try to really sit aggressively into hip internal rotation. It's unnecessary. If you have good contraction around the hip, you don't need to do that. So what we want athletes to actually do is sit as they move forward. So you're falling into hip internal rotation and closed as you move to the target, which delays your hip rotation, which is what we see in elite level throwers. So toe touch, all my weight's here. All I'm doing is falling this way, butt towards the target and backwards as I go. And that's all you're doing. So you're falling into it as you move towards the target. If you guys like this video, thumbs up and subscribe. We're going to show you guys a bunch of different ways to actually stretch hip internal rotation and mobilize it more than what we did today, but you got to start somewhere. And you got to start with flexion and extension, the two most important characteristics to develop in the hip before you start working on some of the other accessory motions. So if you guys like this video, thumbs up, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.